Good evening.
Hi, Steve.
I'm Steve Warner. I'm a consultant, a real property consultant. And I gave you guys a preliminary report of my findings so far. I've done extensive historical research as well as cartographic and legal research, but right now my focus was to try to determine if that any documentation existed pertaining to the low water mark, and I'm not finding.
You let the record show that we're referring to Cartwright Shoal.
I'm sorry, yes.
That's okay.
This is, I'm speaking on behalf of the Cartwright Island, Gardner Island land title foreshore issue.
Thank you.
So, looking through the legal documents, the patents, published histories, everything, at this point right now, I'm not seeing anything referring. I did put a reference in the report. East Hampton historian and attorney in 1926 alluded to the boundaries and foreshore of the Gardner's Island and the surrounding waters he referred to as channels. And, you know, to me, it sounded like if you read it, and I put it exact in quotes, that he's reciting it, and he's, as if he's looking at this, but it's not published with it. And I've looked, which should be in there. You know, everything else would be, the Indian deed, so forth. So I don't know at this point where this might be.
So not having had an opportunity to read this, so are you saying that this particular island, in lack of a better word, kind of looks more like a sandbar to me, but Cartwright Shoal is in fact not East Hampton's ownership, or is it Gardner's ownership? Is a
At this
part of it the
point-
state?
At this point in the investigation, I feel that the title to Cartwright Island is still with Gardner's Island, but I feel that it's part of that complex
Okay.
at this point. Now, you know, get into the legalities of avulsion and accretion, but right now I feel that it is part of it. And I feel if you go back to the Indian purchase, what would be implied, I think it's more common sense that it was part of that. As far as the lands underwater outside of the islands, as I said, I'm not seeing any documentation to that. And I feel that that slate reference seems, if he didn't recite it from the original document, that it sounds to me like he's inferring it from interpreting the patents, particularly the Dongan patent, which specifies beaches and even says harbors, which of course would be inland. But he's saying physical properties of the island. So that's open to interpretation by
So you're saying
today.
the Slate reference?
Slate, yeah. Harry Slate was a historian and an attorney out here in the 20s. And he, when the town started transcribing and publishing the town records and the trustee records starting in the 1880s, by the 1920s they were up to volume 6 and the trustee volumes. And he was the one in charge of transcribing them, editing them, and then he would include chapters called addendum, where he would insert his opinions on things, including that. And that particular passage is from an article called, I believe, Digest of Early Land Grants on Long Island.
What about the ruins? Is it mentioned the ruins? of
Gardner's
Fort
Point
Tyler?
on the north.
Yeah.
Well, he cites that as well, talking about how far the shoals extended. He said 2 miles each way at one time.
So that's-
That's another area to investigate. That I know that they sold it to the federal government,
But they had
White
ownership
House.
of it, right?
Or-
So what would be the waterward boundary of the island? Does it mean high tide? Does it mean low tide? Is there any interpretation of the research you've done that you can share with us regarding what are the boundaries of these said properties?
What do I think at this moment?
Yes, or do you need more time to
The
research it
foreshore?
further? Is it not clear at this time?
Barring a document stating that it's the low water mark, I'd have to say, like everywhere else in New York State, the foreshore is within the state of New York.
So it'd be mean high tide?
Yeah.
Right.
Wouldn't the public trust doctrine go in there? That was part of English law before they granted these patents. Where the public trust doctrine, where the land between low water and high water belongs to the crown and was transferred to the state. And it's open to all people. So that's still effective.
You know, if you read these patents carefully, like the Dongan patent erected it into a manor, and it said, you know, the same rights as municipal townships at that time. So if you look right here in East Hampton, you have foreshore rights to the public. Again, at this moment, right now, my priority was trying to find the specifics of the boundary descriptions. And I've also been comparing it to the numerous other islands in New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, manorial grants. It's vague.
Okay.
Okay. So are you planning to continue further
Oh, yeah.
research on?
I have a lot more. I just wanted to give you
Well-
So
some.
this is like an update, an interim update, so to speak?
I want to discuss that, though. All right, because, you know, we don't have large pockets of money, number one. If there's a contractual agreement between us and Steve, that's fine, but at some point, we have to say, you know, thank you very much for your time, especially when I'm getting the sense that, you know, it appears as if, you know, the Gardeners may in fact own it, which was my contention kind of all along. I think you know where I'm coming from, right? I just,
Yeah, but we don't know yet, do we?
well, you know, and we know it's not trustee property, and yes, the reason I said, go ahead, you have my vote, was because I respect the ability for the public to enjoy these properties, okay? But if all right, this is the first round. Second round, Steve comes back, pretty much the same thing, I'm gonna pull the plug.
Well, why don't we understand where
Sure.
Steve's at with his work and his billings towards us before we
Well-
can pin him to the mat?
I'm not pinning him, I'm just saying,
Let's digest
voicing
this.
my opinion, based on what I'm hearing. Okay.
So
No, I don't plan, just to be clear, this report is not done today, and I'm not planning to bill anymore for what I'm doing. If I have to do tribal research, then I'll ask, I'd like to ask the town board. I feel that they should, at this point, do this, not the trustees.
Well, that makes me feel better already, you know? And we would probably, if I could speak on behalf of my colleagues, you know, we're not that tight. I'm glad there's a wrap-up in this, because, you know, I know it's a difficult thing to prove, and I just don't want to spin all wheels. Thank you.
No, this is not done today, and this is it. This is the contract, and I feel that if I feel it's worthy to travel and hunt some things down, I think the town should pay for it. It's their records.
Steve, may I ask you a question? In terms of the second phase of research that goes beyond the preliminary report, I just have some questions about where you think you'll be focusing. You know, will you be looking to clarify where the boundaries are? And, you know, what can we expect, so to speak,
You mean-
in the second phase?
Precisely like surveying them?
No, not necessarily surveying them, but just, you know, maybe clearer documentation that explains the beaches, the
Yeah.
mean high tide, mean low tide
Yeah, yeah.
discussion.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like there may be 3 different potential boundary points that
Yeah.
have come up in informal
Yeah,
discussions.
it'll be thorough, and anything else you guys would like to see in it, just feel free to tell me. It'll be extensive, and it'll be available for the public. Put it in the Long Island collection. Right now, I'm cataloging so much Gardner material, So we have account books and so forth. So I'm really tackling everything in there as well as outside research on this. Yeah, I'll cover
And
that.
the first release of this information, is that to be to the trustees? As
Oh,
your-
absolutely.
As your client?
It's yours. Yeah,
Okay, thank you, Steve.
yeah.
Yeah, totally reasonable.
So,
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your work, Steve. That's all right.
Hi, how are you doing? I wanted to thank the board for allowing the public the opportunity to come up here and present their concerns. Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask Steve a couple of questions about what he just presented.
No, you're addressing us, you're not addressing
Did you get a
Steve.
chance to read it?
No, I
Then
haven't.
there's
Yeah.
nothing to address.
This is the.
You have
Yeah.
a copy of it?
You can talk to Steve later, and you're welcome, I think, to a copy, right?
Yeah, I have some copies.
Yeah, we'll give you a copy of his determination thus far.
Sure.
Thank you.
It's a work in progress also.
Okay, great. So I wanted to, let you, first of all, several things that I wanted to do tonight, if possible, just briefly update you on the court case. Yesterday was the deadline for the DA to provide discovery in the case. And they had missed a deadline on October 4th to do that. So we have never seen any proof of ownership of Cartwright up until that time. So the DA did provide discovery. However, there was no proof of ownership included in the discovery. The only thing that was included in the discovery was the charging documents that the Harbor Patrol had drawn up with the Galays, which doesn't contain any deed or royal grant or anything of that nature. So, that is, to me, it's a mystery. At this point, that was their deadline for discovery, and they can't introduce any new evidence. So if we go to trial, they're going to trial with no evidence of any proof of ownership. So I don't know why they're not dismissing it, but we're filing a motion to dismiss. But that's the status of it, that nobody has provided proof of ownership to this at this time. The other thing that I wanted to mention briefly with respect to Cartwright, I brought with me a copy of Kavanaugh, which is Kavanaugh, as I'm sure Steve could tell you, is considered the dean when it comes to public trust law in Suffolk County. He's passed away, but he wrote this book called Vanishing Tidelands. And he makes a couple of points that are very germane to this discussion, and that is that, we're very much focused here on who owns Gardiner's Island, not Gardiner's, but Cartwright, as if that makes a difference. But in fact, it really doesn't make a difference, because the public trust right is what is considered a paramount right, which trumps public or private ownership. You may have public or private ownership of a bottomland, but that doesn't mean that people can't sail across those waters. And that's the same with a foreshore of an intertidal land. So he mentions here, even, if I may quote a brief sentence or two, even though the town could assert its title to local waters and the lands under them by retaining the use thereof, it would not do so to the impairment of certain paramount general public rights of use. He cites a case, People versus Staten Island Ferry. The court clearly held that even though the king could grant submerged lands as private property, his grant was subject to the paramount right of the public to use the navigable waters, which he could neither destroy nor abridge. So, in other words, it really doesn't matter. This search into who owns it doesn't entirely matter, because the public trust rights to public access still exist. And I would hope that the trustees would champion that public right, irrespective of who owns the island. Another little item that I wanted to mention, which should be considered, and may be good for you guys to know this, but Kavanaugh mentions that there were many royal grants issued during this time, the same time, not just here, but in this case. And one of the things about them is that they could be revoked, and they frequently were revoked. It mentions these, regarding these grants, their privileges had been granted by charter, and charters could be revoked by the same royal authority from which they came. To be revoked, a charter, franchise, privilege, or liberty had to be proven to have been exceeded. So, to the extent to which the Galays may have sought to, interfere with the public access rights, or even claimed ownership that they don't have, they may have exceeded their royal charter. So in other words, there's the possibility that the Galays may have opened up a can of worms in terms of having exceeded their charter. New York State may have the legal authority to revoke that charter entirely if they're following public trust law. In any event, I also wanted to mention to you regarding Hicks Island. Hicks Island is, you know the situation with the signs there, which have been placed, about 400 yards east of their previous location. So now there's an, yeah.
Could I just add something to that?
Sure.
I did a little research on that and found that the signs had been removed by somebody. They were originally put up by the State Parks Department. They were moved by somebody, basically vandalized. The state sent their people to get down there and replace the signs. They, in error, replaced the signs about 400 yards from where they had been previously, and I believe, I have not been by there, but the state park superintendent assured me that they were moved back to the original spots. Now, to get back to the reason for those signs were installed some 20 years ago initially by the state of New York when Hicks Island truly was not a peninsula as it is now, but it was an island, and it was in an effort to discourage pedestrian traffic over the island while the birds were nesting. It's unfortunate at this time that the East Channel has been allowed to fill in. Feral cats, fox, people, everything have the opportunity to gain access to this, what would be a wildlife sanctuary at this time. And the only thing, Rod, I think you have done well here is shined a light on the fact of the value for the sake of wildlife of Hicks Island. And that if we can, at some point, get Hicks Island back into the island, into the state of it being an island, I think that would be a good thing. And subsequent to that, I think if that were the case, that it would probably be good common sense that even if the public trust doctrines give the public the right to the foreshore, that it would probably be good common sense to stay the hell off of it when the birds are nesting. Would you agree with that?
I think that, there is a good argument for restricted access during bird nesting season. But currently, the way the signs are written, they restrict access year-round. They don't make any distinction between, September and July, for instance. There are no birds nesting there. Really, the nesting stops in July. You only have fledging going on in August. I think that most conservation experts would probably say that the way we do conservation on the bay beaches, et cetera, where you allow access along the foreshore, but you do exclosure fencing, with, string and sign, would exclude the upper beaches from the public. The public could pass along the lower beaches, and that would be fine, because the birds don't nest on the lower beaches. So there's no reason to, even in the bird season, and bird nesting season, exclude the public from places where the birds don't nest. So, that's, I think that we do it very successfully all over the place, and at this point, you know, Hicks Island is not any different from, you know, the rest of Hitherhill State Park or, you know, anywhere else, Napeague State Park, where people can go. So there's no reason to, you know, and then there are plenty of people who need to use that. Kite boarders land over there all the time. Paddle boarders get tired. You know, people in boats have trouble. They need to land. You know, you're not, I don't agree with the idea that that place would be overrun if you allowed legitimate public access. People have to really put a lot of effort to get there. They have to get a boat, a paddle board, something. It's just not the same as, you know,
Well, the problem they
a-
have
a-
right,
a
the
main-
problem they have right now is, you know, you do have access, like with a four-wheel drive. But it's not a great place to turn around. In fact, it's pretty difficult to get turned around down there without finding yourself too far up on the
I agree with you about that. I don't have any objection to cutting off you know, the place where the access to the vehicles was cut off was where the cut was, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's a very good idea to prohibit vehicle access beyond there, because as you go around the south side of Hicks Island, you run into grasslands, marshlands, right? It would be very damaging to those to drive a vehicle across it. So you don't want to really have vehicles go there because of environmental damage. If they go further around the island, they could really get into trouble because the island becomes extremely rocky, and, you know, to the point where you couldn't get around the ruins. So you couldn't make a circuit. So it doesn't make any sense that's a good place to cut off, you know. So I have no objection to that. Look, what I wanted to tell you guys about Hicks Island was that I got a call from George Gorman, who's the Deputy Regional Director for State Parks. And, you know, I'd been asking some questions and asking to speak to somebody who knew about the situation and figure out who placed the signs and why they did. And, you know, I explained to him that I thought that those signs violated the public trust doctrine, New York State Policy number 20, and they also, you know, infringed on your private property rights on the foreshore of Hicks Island. If you don't know it, you own, you know, the foreshore of Hicks Island inside the bay. That's your foreshore, right? So I thought that they illegitimately infringed on your rights and the town and the rights of the residents of East Hampton to enjoy that foreshore. So, you know, I said to him, look, you know, why don't you sit down with the East Hampton Town Trustees and with the you know, other concerned citizens and, you know, have a discussion about what should the signage be, what should it say, you know, so that we're not completely restricting public access there year-round, but there's legitimate public access that's allowed, proper conservation, and you have a balance of public access and conservation, which is what I think the law intends. So he, you know, I said that I would mention this to you guys. He said he wanted to talk with his counsel to find out what the legal realities was of those signages from their point of view. He wanted to find out why they were put up from Tom Dess, but I think he would be open to
I think they
sitting down.
might have, I think, honestly, Rod, I think they may have predated Tom initially.
Well, Tom, well, certainly somebody put up the new signs.
No, Tom Dess put up the new signs.
Yeah, so
He
he
told
put-
me that he did.
Right. And I also did point out to him that those signs are at least improper in that they don't have a designation of who put them up, which is not quite right. But, so anyway, I'm just explaining that to you, but passing that along. And lastly, I promised to tell you who the Cartwrights were. Would you like to know? Take about 5 minutes.
Sure.
Sure. You know, I'd be happy to tell you, since I promised you. You know, last year when I saw some lady kicked off of Cartwright, and it, you know, I just was outraged. I tucked into research the whole issue of public access on Cartwright. And, you know, as I researched it, I found something very interesting. It became very interesting. You know, I wanted to find out, when did the name change from Ram Island? You know, and who was it named for? It turns out that this had been something that had been forgotten at one point by the 1930s. Morton Pennypacker, the famous Long Island historian who was the East Hampton town librarian in the 30s and 40s, put a notice in the paper saying, does anybody know? Because he didn't know who the island was named for. But by the 1940s, I found some documents that some letters from the East Hampton Library to a Cartwright family member inquiring about it. And he had, by that time, figured out that Cartwright Island was named for a C. Cartwright, who was a first mate on a schooner called the Ida Bell. It wasn't very informative, but I chased it down and found, through old newspaper clippings from the 1870s and from writings from Elizabeth Cartwright, who was a writer for the East Hampton Star in the 1930s, pieced together the story. And in fact, Cartwright Island is named for two Cartwrights who were father and son, both heroes of shipwrecks. Captain Frederick Cartwright was, as a young man, the first mate on a whaling schooner called the Johanset, which sailed out of Sag Harbor. And they took on a crew in Honolulu and unfortunately went down on a reef about 1,000 miles northwest of Honolulu. And they hit this reef. They were able to get off in their boats and go to a small island where they came back. It was 12 miles away or so. They scavenged their ship and they built a new boat. Frederick and 6 others sailed 1,000 miles back to Honolulu. It took them something like 43 days. They sailed through a 3-day typhoon. They were all starving, exposure, all kinds of problems. But they got back to Honolulu and they sent back a boat to rescue all of their comrades. And so he was a hero, came back, local hero, raised a family here in Amagansett with about, I think it was about 5 or 6 kids. They were in Amagansett, probably sailing around Gardiner's Bay all the time, visited Cartwright Island with their dad, who unfortunately died only a few years later, and they say from injuries sustained during his ordeal in the Pacific. A few years later, his son, Clifford Cartwright, is the first mate on a ice boat, a clipper ship that's taking, a schooner maybe, that was taking ice from Maine, I think, down to New England. And they were passing by Wellfleet or Massachusetts when a blizzard struck on April 4th, 1876. And the blizzard was intense and the waves were huge, and none of the crew could stand at their posts. Only the captain and Clifford were left standing at the wheel, and the captain was washed down the gangway. Clifford was alone at the wheel. And the captain told him to take cover. Clifford refused, stayed at the wheel, lashed it so that the boat was headed straight for the shore of Wellfleet, and he was washed overboard by a wave and drowned. The boat, however, struck the shore, and the crew was able to get off because of his actions. So he was honored as a hero. His body washed up about a month later. And the story was written up by his cousin, Elizabeth Cartwright. So that's who Cartwright is named for. And they're buried in the cemetery by the windmill, side by side, Frederick and Clifford Cartwright. And blue-collar heroes, not royalty, no royal grants, no privileges, just ordinary Bonnickers.
Thank you very much for that history.
Thank you, Rod.